Human behaviour doesn't run on objective reality. It's driven by meaning and context. Google, Starbucks, Uber, they're really the product of a psychological discovery, not a technological one. Uber doesn't necessarily reduce your wait time for a cab. What it does is it reduces the psychological pain of waiting because you can see there's a car on the way. That's what changes the game. You can make something worth 10 times as much money simply by tweaking with the brain, not the thing itself.
Well, it's magic.
I think that the whole advertising industry has totally lost the plot and that it has become obsessed with that part of advertising which is a media and targeting optimization process. If we assume only that our job is to be the best at something, and if we define ourselves by our competitors, we'll be even worse because we're trying to be better at something that a lot of people are already good at. What's the point of doing that?
Don't be second in a category, invent a new category where you're first.
Exactly. Innovation tends to happen around the edges. The people who successfully innovate are often quite happy to go against the grain, become comfortable with ambiguity. The more ways in which you can look at something, the richer you are.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Rory Sutherland is the quintessential British ad man. He reminds me of the Don Draper of the UK. He's worked for Ogilvy for over 30 years, and he has a new book out called Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Just Don't Make Sense. And that's what marketing is. You're trying to sell things to humans, and humans don't always act logically, and they do weird things. And he talks about things like the placebo effect, how governments try to get things done and actually don't. And he says that a weed is just a flower without a marketing budget. And Rory is a fascinating guy. It's his second time on London Real, and he really gets in to understand the human psyche, and I know you're going to enjoy this episode. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Rory Sutherland, the British advertising icon and Vice Chairman of Ogilvy, one of the largest marketing and communication companies in the world. You are known as an expert on consumer behavior, market trends, and the influence of the internet, earning awards for your work on Microsoft, Unilever, and IBM. You write for The Spectator, you've given multiple TED Talks, and your new book, Alchemy, explores why placebos are so effective, why logic doesn't always pay, and the surprising power of ideas that don't make sense. Rory, welcome back to London Real.
It's a joy to be back. Thank you very much, Brian.
Great having you here. It's been 4 years since we sat down, and I wanted to ask you to start off, what has changed in 4 years in your world of understanding human behavior, technology, advertising influence? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
One of the strangest things that comes to mind is that, in truth, not that much is happening. And this sounds a very strange thing, and it's worth discussing. Because my generation, leaving aside the internet and maybe low-cost air travel, okay, nothing really significant has happened. Now that sounds a ridiculous thing to say.
But that's why you're here.
So two transformative technologies, what an utterly absurd thing to say. If you compare my grandmother, who was born in 1900, where they probably didn't, actually the other grandmother was born in about 1895, they wouldn't have had electric light for the first 15 years of their existence. Laundry would have occupied a day of your life. What she saw between 1895 and roughly 1980 was inordinately more pronounced, I think, in terms of the level of innovation and life-changing technology than what we've seen.
Interesting. So it's slow.
My argument, there's something very strange going on. And I always ask this question. Americans are in a state of extraordinary kind of dissatisfaction in a way because they can't recapture the American dream.
All right, tell me more about this.
Now, I ask the question sometimes, one, was the American dream partly a dream because no other country at the time could share it? So 1945 to 50, the United States had 50% of world GDP.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were the only country that wasn't destroyed in the war.
It was the only country which wasn't either poor to begin with or totally destroyed by war or just generally irredeemably crappy in some way. In this period, an extraordinary number of new innovations became accessible to someone on median income, certainly, even actually someone on low income.
Right.
I think when
Cars, housing.
Refrigerators,
Yeah.
for example. Now, those things were available in 1910, 1920, if you're a Rockefeller, but essentially a whole bunch of things became available to Americans which wouldn't be really commonly available anywhere else for another 20, 30 years. I mean, supermarkets, extraordinary cars. My father used to get American car magazines in his youth, in the sort of 1940s. And he said, reading an American car magazine in, say, 1942, as a 12-year-old English boy, was like reading science fiction. So there were things like, for example, a convertible with an electric hood, okay, which wouldn't really be seen or commonplace in the UK for another sort of 30 or 40 years. Right. The cars were just astounding. The world depicted. I watch and repeatedly watch, because it's a sensational film, North by Northwest. Yeah. And you have to remind yourself as a Brit that this was, 1950?
Probably around there. 50s,
okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the train or the architecture of some of the buildings, for example, it's of a kind which, to a Brit watching it, would have seemed absolutely astounding. There's a famous comment made about a later film, 1960s, Psycho, which is that the shower scene, the shower murder, had slightly less impact in Britain than it did in the United States, because in the UK in 1960, people were astonished by the idea of a hotel room with an ensuite toilet, right? And so they were still getting around the fact that you had a shower, which was by no means, a shower in a hotel room would have been a complete oddity in 1960.
In Britain. Okay.
Having an adjacent shower and toilet in a basic motel would have been unthinkable. My uncle went to Texas in the late 60s, and they apologized to him that there was a black and white television in his hotel room, right? And he was a bit baffled because, he hadn't expected colour TV. He hadn't expected a TV in his room at all. Right. Because a British hotel at that period, older listeners will know this, you had a television room which was set to one channel, and the residents of the hotel came down and sat in chintz chairs and watched the television.
Right.
Okay.
So the Americans had the American dream.
So they had this American dream, and it was partly a dream because no one else had it. And I always wondered, it must slightly piss you off now as an American. Because to be absolutely honest, okay, you've got this kind of narrative that France or Spain or Italy are like really poor and shitty compared to the United States. And yet in terms of those basic possessions, those life-enhancing possessions, there's not much difference, is there? To be absolutely honest, okay. Yeah. It's not as if there's this new weird form of technology coming in which really rich people can afford that no one else can. And I'm in the weird position. Now, I talk to a few other tech people on Twitter about this, and we don't like to talk about it much because it makes you look like a kind of first world problem, bit of a spoiled arsehole. But we actually say, look, the weird thing about tech is, one, of course, electronic tech, internet tech, is extraordinarily egalitarian in many ways, in that it's a bit like Warhol's great comment on Coke, which is, all the Cokes are the same and all the Cokes are good. The President of the United States can't get a better Coke than the bum on the corner of the street. Right. And now, okay, I'm sounding like a bit of an arsehole to say that tech's like that. But actually, if you're a Premiership footballer, you have a PS4, you might be able to buy it 3 months earlier than someone on median income. But ordinary people can buy that same thing which when you think about it is extraordinary, the extent to which most people, in the UK, someone on median income who really, really wanted to could effectively have the best mobile phone handset in the world. Okay. There are other categories like that. Sherry is a weird one for some reason, where I don't know why this is. The most expensive bottle of wine in the world costs hundreds of thousands of pounds. The best sherry in the world, you can pretty much, for some reason, sherry is never premiumized or has lost its premium quality to a degree. But that's extraordinary. But there's also an extraordinary thing, which is if you gave me 100,000 quid and said, okay, take this to your branch of Curry's PC World or whatever, and use it to improve your life, I could get a few marginal improvements in. I might buy a massive projector, I guess. I don't know. I might buy a bigger television. My wife would probably stop me. And I actually, to be honest, after I'd spent about 2,000 quid, I'd be at a loss to know what to do.
Okay. And so what does that mean? Is that
so there's something strange, which is we always talk about economics, and everybody measures how much money people have got to spend. But equally important to me in economics is consumption and what people have to spend their money on.
Right.
And I'm almost becoming a bit of a socialist, which is weird for someone like me, in the sense that if all the very rich end up doing with their excess money isn't, now, okay, my grandparents, they had the 4th dishwasher in Wales, okay? That was a massive status symbol then, if they'd wanted it to be. I mean,
yeah.
And they weren't particularly blingy, they just loved practical gadgetry. And this thing was the price of a car, practically. Okay. But a dishwasher is a real thing. It's a transformational, brilliant idea, which, you know, I mean, put it this way, it's a technology which, if yours broke, you would immediately set about getting it fixed, right? You wouldn't go, I'm perfectly happy for 4 weeks without a dishwasher, would you really?
No. So your point is that
But
even,
there isn't anything.
right. So rich people today, even if you make an extra million,
It's-
you go consume, your life isn't going to be marginally increased.
So there is a phrase that
So
describes
this American
which is,
dream of making our lives a lot better.
So part of the reason the
doesn't
American
exist.
dream was a dream was that you were enjoying it while everybody else was having a nightmare.
Right.
But part of the reason the American dream was a dream was that your extraordinary non-shittiness of your economy for that glorious period also coincided with an extraordinary number of things which were suddenly affordable, which were really worth buying. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, no one's going to dispute the fact that a car is a big thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now
no one's disputing the fact that a dishwasher, washing machine, fridge is a huge thing.
And now we don't have that anymore.
You don't really have.
And so we're a little upset that we don't have that dream.
Well, I mean, how can you laud it? You know, how do you laud it over the Spanish when? Okay, you know, okay.
Well, we can't anymore.
You can't really, can you? Because in terms of basic quality of life, I wonder if there's a kind of weird. It's worth remembering that, to some degree, economics has always assumed that actually, the left has always assumed that human wants are kind of finite, if you like, and therefore, you know, socialism that provides people with the basis of their needs. The right has always argued, no, actually what made consumerism extraordinary is that, and what made communism not work, is that the ingenuity of capitalism was continually providing people with what you might call instrumental advantages.
Yeah.
So there's a great phrase which is, as well as economic inequality, there's instrumental inequality, which is the difference between what rich people can do and what poorer people can do. And until someone invents something really weird, okay, you know, I mean, maybe there is some strange, like, one-person self-flying drone that I can climb in and I can get to work and land on the roof in, you know, 20 minutes from Sevenoaks. And that costs 90,000 quid or 150,000 quid. Now, actually what Silicon Valley will do is it will Uberize that technology. It won't actually sell it to me.
Right, it'll just equalize it.
It'll essentially just, you
that's
know.
where the bigger market
I mean,
share is.
Uber Lux is an extraordinary thing, by the way. Do you ever use it?
I have used it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Don't tell too many people, because, you know, I don't want to reduce availability. But for a little bit more than the black cab, you get an S-Class Mercedes turning up. Now, Uber Lux is essentially, now obviously it's not something you'd use every day, but it's essentially a chauffeur when you want one for 20 or 30 quid a pop.
Right, so really good value there.
I mean, it's extraordinary.
Let me
So there's this interesting thing, which is, until we can actually argue, okay, the people who are wealthier are buying significant instrumental, practical advantages with their money, and by doing so are funding the affordability of those same things to everybody else. You know, the great role that I think income inequality did play is in many cases the rich funded the early development of things like washing machines, televisions, radios, and then eventually those things through mass manufacture became more and more affordable over time.
Okay.
So there's an argument that what rich person's status seeking did was it was in a way the status seeking of rich people was a kind of R&D funding exercise for the wider population.
Okay.
Now, if people only spend their money on property, for example, or on sitting in the front of the plane rather than the back, that same useful function doesn't seem to be being performed.
Okay, understood. Let me ask you about something that happened yesterday, and I want to get Rory's marketing perspective of this. We have a new prime minister. His name is Boris Johnson, who was there on probably the back of the Brexit vote, which is a marketing phenomenon itself, which I'd like to ask you about. But Boris, he is, and you talk about this in your book, illogical. You look at him as a candidate, you remember the Tony Blairs and the Bill Clinton days. I mean, they all had personal stylists and people that would cut their hair and do their makeup, and it was considered that was always going to be the leader. That was this obvious, I don't know what it is, perfect person. But now you have someone like Boris Johnson. How does that play from a logic, illogic, that is our leader now? Is that intentional? If you were his marketing guru, could you create that?
I think he's his own marketing guru for good and ill, and I think that's true of Trump as well. And me and a bunch of other people have also made the point that Trump is instinctively much, much cleverer than intellectual people think he is.
Right, he's instinctively clever, not intellectually clever.
No, well, I don't think, by the way, I don't think the man is a total idiot, by the way, which is a common aspersion by any means. And he has a certain negotiator's instinct and a certain communicator's instinct, which you might expect a real estate salesman to have.
Definitely. Always bluffing, always coming on strong.
And actually, one of the things he does also, which is, I wrote a piece about this. There's a strange, if you take the sort of social justice movement, and there's a wonderful paper in a website called, I think, Ario, which makes this point. It's become a kind of religion. And weirdly, a large part of the behavior of the social justice movement is actually deeply counterproductive. Because if you get really, really obsessed about, for example, certain speech codes, and you react to the violation of those codes in the way that a religious person would react to blasphemy, okay? And therefore what you do is you evidence disgust. Generally, your opponents hate you. So the two things I think that the social justice movement has which make it look like, in a sense, deeply flawed Protestantism, okay, is one, weirdly, they turn on themselves to an extraordinary degree. There's no concept of kind of solidarity because they actually hate an apostate or a heretic more than they hate an atheist. Okay, so that's the first thing. So they will turn on people who are actually, well, they'll turn on Jermaine Greer and they'll turn on Peter Tatchell, for fuck's sake. Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
Okay.
Why is that? And why is that?
Okay.
Why is that bad? Explain those two cases if people don't know that.
That's extraordinarily bad for creating a kind of cohesive movement where you're competing to show moral purity to a point where actually you'll start condemning people who are who you should be actually admiring.
Okay, part of your movement, but then you condemn them.
The second thing is your reaction of disgust and horror. People really, really hate being treated with contempt. And what Trump did, as I said, he found the thermal exhaust port on the liberal Death Star because he had to just cross one of these lines a little bit, okay, by saying bad hombres, okay. He knew all those people, including journalists, by the way. I'm not only just talking about, the head of gender studies at the, whatever it is, college, okay, some liberal arts college. He knew that those people and the press would go batshit crazy about it and start calling him a racist. And he knew that reaction was actually net to his electoral advantage, particularly in the places which he needed to win. Because the extent to which the left has abandoned what you might call its old economic aims and become insanely preoccupied with gender and race to the exclusion of almost anything else, is an extraordinary kind of Achilles heel. And Trump exploited that because he knew, okay, if I simply behave in this way, the press will actually give me an insanely disproportionately high amount of publicity. And to some extent, I hate to say this, but fame is basically good, okay? By being 5 times more famous than all the other contenders for the Republican nomination, simply generating noise basically works in that context. Now, Johnson's interesting because Corbyn's also interesting because Corbyn and Johnson are, although very different politically. If you think about Corbyn, someone should have realised very quickly that he was going to win that election for the Labour Party leadership anyway, even without a lot of kind of extreme left-wing people mobilising, simply because you had 3 very identical candidates and 1 distinctive one. And it's kind of like, I think Dave Trott calls it Gestalt theory. But if you have a whole screen of zeros with an X in the middle, the human brain spots the X in about a millisecond.
Right. Is this where politics and marketing?
So the 3
overlap?
identical candidates split the vote. Corbyn as the 4th candidate. This is why, by the way, the Tory leadership election at least narrows it down to 2 before it goes out to a public vote, because otherwise you have that fundamental problem, which is that you have the XXXY problem, which is essentially, the 3 X's are indistinguishable and therefore divide support, whereas the one distinctive person attracts everybody on a particular part of the spectrum.
Okay, understood.
The fact that he had a beard was pretty much a winner. You could have put anybody forward with a beard, and I think they would have won.
Just to have that distinct
if he won
aspect.
if Andy Burnham had been persuaded to wear a large beanie hat throughout the campaign, he probably would have won.
Is that what Boris did?
No, well, Boris does the same thing, which is he's distinctive, and it's worth remembering that.
Is that by design, or is that his personality?
It's both, I suspect.
Same with Trump.
Well, I suspect, to be honest, I think he knows that he can't play the other game. Okay,
Right. So why bother? So just
why bother?
And magnify it a bit.
Secondly, it's worth remembering, of course, that I was slightly defending his role to my wife, who doesn't like this at all, by saying that actually leadership qualities and show business qualities are much, much scarcer in politics than administrative ability. Now everybody goes, no, a good politician, he's the prime minister, he should be, have high quality. Now actually, you can outsource that stuff. You can delegate that stuff.
The administrative.
The ability to be a figurehead might be, and I would argue, I have no idea, okay. To be honest, I suspect that Richard Branson, I think he might be dyslexic, actually, an extraordinary figure, which is a remarkable number of entrepreneurs are actually dyslexic. I generally don't know how good Richard Branson is at running a spreadsheet, okay, reading a spreadsheet, or how good he'd be if you asked him to perform some complicated feat of logistics.
No, I think he outsources a lot of that.
But exactly, being the figurehead for an airline and saying this is what this airline is about, it's not like other airlines, okay? Yeah. He does something which very few heads of a PLC could do. And I think we are suffering this problem where organizations are increasingly, Apple, kind of run by the finance director.
Right.
And I'm sure that Tim Cook is a much better finance director than Steve Jobs would have been.
Right.
But in terms of creating that extraordinary distinctiveness, and in terms of unifying an extraordinarily vociferous and cranky group of people like Apple employees stroke Brits, the value of what Johnson does, even though I'm by no means an unqualifying fan, I have huge doubts on all sorts of levels.
But he is a leader and a figurehead.
It's a scarcer human quality than administrative ability.
Okay. And do you think corporates need it as well? Do you think Apple needs more of a Jobs figure as opposed less of a Tim Cook figure?
I think it's hugely valuable to have within a business. I would say this, wouldn't I? But within a business, to have someone at the top who essentially is happy to go against the grain,
Okay. Is
some
this
extent.
you in your case, in your company?
I'm only the vice chairman. I don't have, but I think having a percentage of people, as you would do in an ad agency, having a creative director who's a highly distinctive character, those things are really, really useful. If you think about it, the great ad agencies were all founded by creative people. You go back, Bernbach, Ogilvy, etc. And what has happened is they've become overly administrative in that managerial qualities are probably over-rewarded, and creative, so in other words, the people who measure and count the money are becoming, in all organizations, more valued than the people who generate the value.
Right, the creatives, right.
Yeah.
You mentioned America and the American dream, and is that really where modern marketing was born? When you had all of a sudden this lower and middle class, you had all this stuff to sell them, people had a choice because it wasn't communist Russia, so now, is that when marketing evolved? Or was
and I suppose you also had an interesting thing, because what we often forget, a few episodes of Mad Men make this clear, is a surprise.
Do you like Mad Men? Do you like watching it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's both it's both actually very accurate and very inaccurate as a depiction of the time.
And you knew the later versions of those Mad Men when you started?
I still know one or two people who, Joel Raffleson in Chicago, he and his wife were both copywriters in Ogilvy in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
I had a very interesting observation. I went out to dinner with them both, and I said, to what extent is it an accurate depiction of... and Joel himself said, oh, it was nothing like that. I mean, the depiction of the philandering and the drunkenness and so forth, I mean, really, it's monstrously overblown. And his wife turned to him and said, Joel, it was exactly like that. So, depending on the male or female perspective, it's worth remembering, by the way, it was complicated in that there would have been a large number of agencies in the 50s, I'm not sure it didn't include J. Walter Thompson, major agencies which wouldn't even handle alcohol accounts.
Okay.
So we've got to remember that, of course, America was only 20 years, 30 years after Prohibition. There was still, quite a lot of America was very, very puritanical then.
Okay.
But presumably, agencies did start to spring up, which were much, much more maverick in all sorts of ways.
Okay.
But I mean, Jeremy Bullmore remembers that a bunch of American board directors came over and attended the JWT Christmas party in London, and were reported back, the directors' wives reported back with some horror that there was quite a lot of dancing. So, I mean, that is the strangest thing about the United States, which is your utterly bizarre and actually, in some ways, I think, irreconcilable mixture of weird sexual and other license combined with Puritanism.
It always works that way.
It always. But I mean, Britain, I think, has reached a kind of accommodation.
Yeah, well, you're closer to the continent where people are, but it's somewhere in between. But I say Britain is, it has less.
We're kind of in mid-Atlantic, I think, aren't we? I think.
Yeah.
We've never had a big hang-up about booze, really. I mean, that's never been a thing.
But yeah, America definitely has that. Well, ad men, that was kind of what Wall Street was later, what the oil business was like later, what tech was like later. I mean, that's where the action was, right? That's where the hot shots went.
Of course, you had 50% media commission. You had the sudden coming of television, which was extraordinarily potent. You also had this thing which we often forget, which is a surprising number of American brands were at the time regional. And so there was essentially, with the coming of national distribution and national media to support national distribution, because remember, if you think about it, your newspapers, you've never really had a national newspaper.
Sure.
Okay, back then. So the extent to which television, by dint of being national, forced these once slightly regional brands to compete for national dominance in a kind of winner-takes-all competition, that must have driven extraordinarily high ad spend.
Yeah.
And so probably by dint of receiving commission, there were agencies which were, for a short time at least, 10, 15 years, I mean, literally insanely rich. I mean, it would have been an extraordinary way because they simply copied the commission and payment system from press.
Okay.
And of course, so, when you multiply the numbers by 10 or 15, these numbers became spectacular.
So lavish expense accounts, real estate, the pay packages, that's what we see kind of in Mad Men and everything. And is there still a hangover from that marketing to today?
You also have a slightly advantageous thing, which is because you were effectively paid by your clients, but because the money, the commission, came from the the media owner, and you were technically, I think it was in Britain, it was illegal to rebate commission to anybody else for a long time. So in a weird way, you weren't entirely paid by your clients. They could withdraw their business, but they weren't actually writing checks to you. They wrote checks to the media, and you got your 15%. And that probably gave you an independence of mind as well, because you weren't always there haggling about what the blended hourly rate was.
Okay, gotcha. So, and how did that carry over to where we are today when it comes to marketing? You said the American dream is still some twisted version of that's old, is still in the consciousness, but, you know.
Well, no, it does interest me about the American dream, which is that it was partly a dream because everybody else was having a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's also interesting because I don't think, barring some strange nuclear catastrophe, I don't think you're ever going to see one country being that much relatively richer than everyone else, or at least relatively better in terms of quality of life. Now, the reason I raise all these questions about instrumental inequality is I would argue that we ought to now start looking for improvements in quality of life. Now, bear in mind, this is going to sound like weirdly left-wing. It's simply pragmatic, okay? We should start to look to improve people's life with greater amounts of leisure rather than necessarily with greater amounts of money.
Okay.
Because at some point, if the money is being spent in a way that is either completely rivalrous, the property market, essentially just inflated because people are competing for scarce commodities, zero-sum game, okay? The washing machine was not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Okay, that was, that's an enormous benefit. Now, here's a great thought experiment, okay? If you ask people, it's Robert H. Frank, who wrote a book called The Darwin Economy, fantastic economist and evolutionary psychologist. If you ask people, would you rather live in a world where you earned £50,000 a year and everybody else earned 30? Or would you rather live in a world where you earned £80,000 a year and everybody else earned 100? Okay. Quite a lot of people choose the first. And the reason they choose the first is not irrational, because relative wealth, in some respects, if you're trying to attract the opposite sex, for instance, if you want to buy beachfront housing, okay, may be much more important than absolute wealth. In fact, when you go to Ogilvy, what's slightly painful about Ogilvy is the chief executive of Ogilvy in London and the chief executive of Ogilvy in New York probably have the worst quality of life, I would argue, objectively, of any major senior person in Ogilvy. If you're the head of Ogilvy in a Latin American country, okay, you don't earn as much as the person in New York does, but your house is bloody spectacular, okay, right? It's on some cliff overlooking a tropical beach, whereas the person in New York's, they've got a nice apartment, but it's nothing to write home about. Now, if you ask just a different question, which is, would you rather live in a world where you had 4 weeks vacation and everybody else got 5, or would you rather live in a world where you got 6 weeks vacation and everybody else got 8? Sorry, have I got that right?
Yeah.
Most people say I'd rather live in the 6-week vacation world,
right,
because vacation is not a relative status good, it's an absolute good, and more of it is better than less, regardless of what everybody else has. So leisure time is a good. It's not a competitive, rivalrous good like money is for chasing property, I would argue, personally, I think the whole travel industry has gone batshit crazy, okay? In that, for young people who have anyone, hey, cars aren't really a status thing anymore. In fact, I don't own a car. Right? Okay.
Is that your young voice?
Sorry, my young person voice. I don't even own a car. I probably belong to a car club. Okay, and I think it was now.
But they use travel.
But they use travel as a status indicator. Right. I think if you went to university now, and you'd never been anywhere long haul, you'd be at a significant mating disadvantage to some git who'd been to Machu Picchu. And so they just have different, the status competition is the same, the currency changes.
Okay.
Now, I asked an audience of millennials and young folk in a room once, all London resident, okay, how many of you have been to Machu Picchu? And then I asked, how many of you have been to see Lincoln Cathedral? And the ratio was about 2 or 3 to 1. Machu Picchu. Now, you can go to Lincoln Cathedral in the day from London, okay? Now, okay, whatever you want to say. 1, you don't get altitude sickness, okay? 2, architecturally, it's a lot better. Machu Picchu, right? Thirdly, I'm not even sure watching a 4K documentary on Machu Picchu wouldn't be more valuable than actually going there, to be absolutely honest. Now, so the really interesting thing there is that leisure is something people enjoy for its own sake, whereas money, I think, is increasingly something people enjoy for the business of pursuing personal status and rivalry, which is a zero-sum game.
Okay, and that affects the way we market to people today.
Well,
It really does.
I think we've got to ask questions. We've got to start asking questions about. I mean, there are economists. I mean, weirdly, there's a strange economic movement called something like post-scarcity luxury communism,
Okay.
which essentially says that we become so efficient at manufacturing and distributing goods that that nearly everybody in the world who wants to will eventually be able to live a life of considerable opulence. Okay. Now, at that point, you actually need to introduce communism, essentially, in order to simply because.
Money doesn't motivate anyone.
Or what you might end up with is absurd inequalities of wealth.
Okay. We'll see if we get there.
We'll see if we get there.
In the book, you talk about this concept of perception versus reality, and you make a great example in the first part about Coca-Cola versus Red Bull. And I think this is interesting because everyone watching has probably consumed both of those beverages. But tell me what you see when you see the way Red Bull introduced their product into a market that before had never seen anything like that, and how they did things that were unobvious and illogical. Because much of marketing is illogical, and that's why it's fascinating.
Well, I think there's a really vital thing which has actually importance not only for marketers and market researchers, also for people doing artificial intelligence and working with big data, which is the human behavior doesn't run on objective reality. It's not driven by objective reality. It's driven by meaning and context. So the same thing in a different context can appear totally different to the human mind and therefore lead to totally different behavior. Even though the thing itself may be the same, simply changing the context changes everything.
Right. I always think of the Mark Twain book.
Repainting the fence.
Repainting the fence, yeah, where he gets his friends to pay him to paint the fence.
The fence, because if you portray fence painting, and of course, if you think about that, we see examples of that. There's a wonderful Onion parody about upper middle class women in sort of Marin County engaging in candle making. Now, in the 18th century, candle making was a necessary piece of domestic drudgery, and the second you could actually buy ready-made candles, you were hugely grateful for the opportunity. But suddenly, what was once a kind of, an 18th century, necessary, totally tedious piece of drudge work, suddenly becomes a kind of, an extraordinary pleasure.
Right.
Bread making, another example,
Yeah.
And artisan basically means manufactured through an inefficient process, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And
Which is all the rage these days.
which is that's interesting in itself, because what it's evidence of, I think, the hipster movement, which I thoroughly endorse, by the way, is saying, look, actually, there isn't an equivalent to the washing machine anymore. Really, there isn't this thing that can really change my life. Now, by the way, the washing machine, if you think about it, really enabled women to enter the labour force, so its knock-on effects were much more significant than merely avoiding a day of drudgery.
Okay.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to do the things we always enjoyed. We're just going to do them better. So we're going to make really, really good toast. And actually, I find that business of doing basic, immutably good pleasures like breakfast and just saying, let's just do it incredibly well. I find that actually, it's, to be honest, the psychological value is probably more than the intrinsic value. But it's a pretty harmless way of our enjoying ourselves, I think.
Yeah, and perception reality.
So I'm very pro-hipster. I think hipsters should be subsidised, actually.
Ha!
And it'd be a very interesting economic argument that you
Universal
should take.
basic
well,
hipster
if you
income.
pay hipsters to move into, I think they could solve the housing crisis. Because once you've got 2 or 3 hipster cafes, okay, any area becomes an acceptable place to live. If you've got high-speed fibre optic broadband and some hipsters, you've essentially gentrified.
You have a
Okay.
point there.
Okay, so
The government should
so
see-
actually paying hipsters to say there's a town in South Wales which really needs an artisan sourdough bakery.
You might be onto something
Okay,
there.
maybe-
So
okay.
you said
They're
perception
the shock
reality.
troops of
and you men-
gentrification.
And you
Yeah.
mentioned AI as well. So how does that? I had a guy in here.
Oh,
named-
okay. So it's the fact that what AI has access to is information about reality,
Yeah.
price, okay, information about behavior, sales. What it doesn't have information on is the weird black box of human perception that goes on in between. So let me give you an example of this. There were some bird perception scientists, I'm sure there's a better name for it than that, were doing experiments showing parrots photographs, right? And they were slightly baffled by the behaviour, the reaction of parrots to these photographs. And it was a mixture of things shown on screen and things shown in print. And for example, I'm making this up, but this could be the kind of thing. You might show them a picture of a ripe banana and they're completely uninterested. Okay. What you remember is parrot vision, okay, is, first of all, they can detect ultraviolet. Secondly, they have completely different sensitivity in their cones, in their eyes, to a totally different part of the wavelength. So remember, a photograph of a yellow banana and a TV picture of a yellow banana is not actually producing any yellow photons at all. It's producing equal amounts of red and green photons, and the red and green are calibrated to the areas of sensitivity in the human eye. And so your TV is species specific. All colour printed magazines is species specific.
Okay, so what you're saying is...
Unless you actually print in real colours. Does anybody print in full?
I don't know.
I don't know.
So what's the point? The parrots are seeing these things and not reacting.
We go, parrots aren't interested in ripe bananas. But the parrot wasn't seeing a ripe banana. The parrot was seeing a banana that was green or black or I don't know what it was, but okay. But it wasn't seeing a ripe banana because actually what looks like a ripe banana to a human in print or on TV, not in reality, doesn't look like a ripe banana to a parrot, okay? And in the same way, what we might do when we look at big data is we might draw conclusions about the relationship between reality and behavior, which are entirely erroneous. One, we may assume I won't go into this in a huge amount of detail. We may assume a huge amount of ergodicity. So we may assume that what the average does once is what everybody does over time on average.
Right.
And that may be completely wrong. Okay.
Right.
So we may get, by having these snapshots and averaging them, we may assume that the average of a group, that the collective simultaneous average of a group behavior is representative of the over time average behavior of an individual within that group, which isn't a true assumption. Okay. So that's the ergodicity problem. The context problem is the Red Bull one. It's the parrot one, which is if you asked a load of people, what would make a great drink as an alternative to Coca-Cola? Everybody would tell you, accurately in a way, I want a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can so I get great refreshment for my money, okay? The most successful attempt to compete with Coke, Red Bull, does the opposite. It costs a fortune, comes in a tiny can, and it tastes disgusting, right? Now, when they researched the taste, people said this is disgusting. Now, my contention is, if you flip the context from drink to drug, those three qualities which make Red Bull an appalling drink make it a brilliant placebo. All medicinal products have to taste weird, otherwise we don't believe they're medicinal, right? If you think about it, everything has to taste a bit weird, right?
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, if you sell vitamin C, you can make it taste really tasty. Don't. I think the placebo effect is much stronger if you make it taste slightly foul.
Okay.
Red Bull, by the way, they researched it with a company that only researches the taste of carbonated drinks, and people basically said things like, the company said this is the worst drink we've ever researched in the whole history of our company. Normally people say things like, it's too sweet for me. No, it's a drink for kids, really. Here they were saying things like, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. But as a drug, the small can says this drug's really potent, okay? Because we can't give you a full 375 millilitres. I don't know what that was. Sorry about that.
Your phone, maybe. And so it was marketed not as a drink, now as a drug. It gives you wings.
And therefore, the small quantity, the high price, and the weird taste, which in the context of perceiving a drink make it a very bad drink indeed, make it a brilliant drug.
Is that from the immutable laws of marketing where it says don't be second in a category, invent a new category where you're first?
Exactly, yeah. So in a sense it did create a category. And so the example I also give is if you look at people's pizza behaviour, nearly everybody orders their pizza for as soon as possible. And it was assumed in pizza delivery that what everybody wanted was basically instantaneous pizza delivery. We argue that maybe that's true, maybe it's context. Sorry, rephrasing Maybelline ad-end lines unconsciously there. The point being that the default on the web, if you order a pizza, is ASAP. The default on your mobile phone is ASAP. If you ring up, they never say, when would you like your pizza to arrive? They assume, unless you state otherwise, that you want it as soon as possible. Then we said, what if you just change the context of ordering, and particularly, so you don't assume that it's going to be immediate. You make the default further out than ASAP. But also what happens if you actually ask the question as a time of day, not as a duration? Because if you ask for it as a duration, people tend to go, I want it as soon as possible. If you ask for it, would you like to arrive at 8:15, 8:20, 8:25, 8:25, 8:30, a lot of people will go, well, I'd want it to arrive in half time, or actually I wouldn't mind having a shower. So why don't I get it to arrive in an hour's time?
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.